an expert in systems, processes, and just making businesses grow and making businesses go. Thank you so much for being with us, Brandee, and I'm really excited to hear about your thoughts on solving some of these really big problems that a lot of business owners face. But before we get into that, could you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you for having me, first and foremost. I'm excited to be the first guest. I'm not sure I realized that until you said it just now, but
Some people
um,
save the best for last, but I was like,
very,
let's just go for it.
thank you. Thank you. So, yes, I'm here today, obviously, to explore the topic of processes, which a lot of people, believe it or not, Roy, don't like to talk about. They think that they create more resistance, but I obviously believe the opposite. And I've learned that over almost 30 years of leadership and sales experience. So, I started my outside sales career um, somewhat naively. I loved the product I was going to be selling, but by nature, I'm pretty introverted. And what I learned in sales, and certainly in sales leadership after that, and an operations role running the whole organization, was that the key to success and what really levels the playing field for teams is their processes. I believe that when you have great processes, it removes the pressure from the people and allows things to naturally flow. So that starts with just the flow of information and then goes right through, of course, to what that information is, how it's telling us to execute on the tasks at hand.
When it comes to process, what are sort of the main areas where you find that people are having issues?
The issues are usually rooted, again, in just the flow of information. We're usually looking at issues that affect the company overall. So, an example of that would be not everyone understands or is operating in alignment with the core values of the company. Onboarding, a lot of issues arise there when a new hire is coming on board excited about this new position, and then they find out quickly that the position isn't necessarily what they thought it was based on the way things are executed. Training, of course, if I'm in a role and I have, a leader, meaning someone who isn't technically my supervisor, but who is supposed to be the expert, what have you, and they're telling me one thing, but my actual manager is telling me something different, then things certainly come up in training. And then even policies and procedures, when employees feel like things as simple as the dress code is interpreted differently for different individuals or different departments, that can really disrupt things. And I think a lot of times, as leaders or owners, we tend to overlook those small details.
Are there any red flags or signals that people could be looking out for just to be like, oh, we've got a process problem here in any one of those areas?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that signal that there's a process issue. Um, a big one for companies that are getting their feet under them still is that there are one or two or a handful of people who hold all the secrets. If the rest of the team is asking the same questions over and over again of the same people, that's typically a process problem. Sometimes it is exposed through handoff situations. If delivery doesn't know what sales is actually promising, or sales doesn't know how accounting is billing customers, That obviously is a process problem. And then the other one is just, and the most obvious, is the overall efficiencies of the company.
And when you say that, you mean just they're looking at things and maybe they've got their dashboard or whatever KPIs that they're looking for, and they feel like um, we're not achieving as much as we should be, or we're not completing things as quickly as we should.
Right. When expectations aren't being met, that is often a process issue. But also, if there is inconsistency in how those expectations are being met, that is almost always related to process.
And then, so where do you start when it comes to fixing those issues, or starting to, say you've got somebody who's, well, at this point, let's keep it broad. Just what would you say are some of the ways that people can zero in on coming to a solution?
Um, I think, first of all, it's being honest with ourselves. Oftentimes as leaders, or certainly founders of companies, we've invested a lot, not just finances and time, but our heart is in the company. And with that, we tend to be the heartbeat of the company. In some ways, that's great. But when it comes to processes and systems within the company, that doesn't work. If everything is operating again around one person or a few key people, that really stunts growth. And being honest with ourselves about that is the first step, really. From there, it's diving into what's actually going on. If you have a function that a few people are performing, and one person is much faster and much better, talking to them about what they're doing, but also talking to their counterparts about what they're doing. Because what you may find out is that the all-star has a great process that the others just don't understand. But you also may find out that the all-star is cutting a lot of corners, and that's why they're so fast. You want to surface those issues where they're cutting corners before it becomes a true problem down the road.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, and so I love that idea of looking for what at least maybe appear to be bright spots. Somebody is doing a great job, and either you can learn from what they're doing right, and then
Right.
maybe if there's some areas where it's like, oh wow, they're doing really, they're getting through these really fast because they're just uh throwing them all in the trash
Right.
or something like
Exactly.
that. Either
Exactly.
way, that's something you kind of look for, those outliers maybe. um
Right.
well, what are some of the most common problems that you see? Maybe you could tell us one or two from each of those areas: the company overall, the onboarding, the training, and then the policies.
Right. I think with onboarding, the biggest challenge is that companies have yet to understand that when a new hire starts with them, they're auditioning. The days of walking into your first day at a new company and assuming that you're going to be there for even 5 years, let alone 10 or 15, are long gone. I think new hires walk in, um, I wouldn't say skeptical, but they're looking for confirmation that what they're expecting is the reality. So when onboarding is unorganized, or there are, again, conflicting messages, if they're reading on a screen that the dress code is no jeans, but they look around and they see 5 people in the office wearing jeans, that is a red flag to them. And things can really spiral from there So having an onboarding process that is clear and consistent, but also that allows them to feel involved right from the beginning is is very important. Um, Training, there are so many issues that I see with training. Um, Understanding how people learn, I think, is the core of that. And understanding that as adult learners, we all learn very differently is such a key in training that a lot of companies miss, which isn't necessarily, through any fault of their own. Again, oftentimes we train things the way we perceive that they've always been done, but we forget that someone coming in may have had completely different experience and it may not make sense to them. So using different avenues for training, obviously hands-on training, but having documentation to back that up, combined with videos, combined with knowledge checks at certain points, is so important. The policies I talked a little bit about with onboarding, just making sure that policies are clear and consistent. And then with the overall company, I think the key is to just make sure that employees feel empowered, because when they're in the know, they tend to do a lot more. So again, clarity and accessible information can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, that does seem to be one that's, and this kind of goes through all these areas, is just clarity and understanding expectations, because I think most people have been through that situation where you go in for your first day at work and there's like, you feel like you don't know what to do, or maybe somebody, they drop you off at your desk and you're like, well, I mean, I don't want to just sit here and play Angry Birds. You know, it's
Right.
2025. People haven't played Angry Birds in a decade, but you've
Exactly.
got to do something.
Right, right, right. It's very interesting. I worked with a company recently who had 65 employees. I mean, a decent sized company where the CEO made a point of meeting with every new hire for 90 minutes, which on the surface is a great idea, right? He's very invested. You would think that as a new hire to spend that kind of time with the CEO would be very, make you feel very welcomed, what have you. But here's the challenge: he had 65 employees and was running a, a big company, a lot bigger than 65 employees from an operations standpoint. So sometimes he met with a new hire on the first day. Sometimes he didn't meet with them for 2 or 3 weeks. That was the first challenge, was if I was hired 4 weeks ago and I just had my meeting yesterday, and I see Johnny, who got hired this morning, is getting his meeting today, something in me thinks, consciously or not, that Johnny's role is more important than mine. So that's a problem. And in these meetings, he would talk about the company history, which he was justifiably very proud of. He would also talk about the core values of the company and the vision of the company. All really important things that you want everyone on your team to understand. But he was so passionate and so excited about what he was talking about that when we dug in with new hires, not necessarily new, but people who'd been through this process, they told us that that meeting was very intimidating to them and overwhelming, that it felt more like a sales pitch or a dog and pony show than a welcome. So that was fascinating to me because, again, on the surface, how many CEOs meet with every new hire?
Not many.
Right, right. So by restructuring that small piece of their onboarding into a situation where they had access to the company history, were welcomed by this man through video in that section, and then went through each of their 5 core values on their own, including a video from him and a written, it's not really documentation there, but a written narrative, I guess, about each of those values and how they apply. Having them go through that prior to meeting with him completely changed the dynamics of that conversation. Now, in their onboarding meeting, they were talking about which of the core values resonated the most with them and which of the core values they had experienced or applied in other roles that they had had. And asking him questions about the company history, because the process changed to make them feel more included in the process rather than having that information kind of thrown at them. So just those small nuances of, again, making information accessible to people can have a huge impact.
So you're working with a guy. He's clearly cares about the company and clearly
Absolutely.
cares about his new hires, but it's kind of like the best intentions, uh,
Yeah,
but maybe not being taken the way that he wanted. So he comes in and he basically, you're able to look at that and figure out, okay, let's make sure that you're accomplishing what you want to accomplish. And I mean, honestly, it sounds like the tweaks you would have made not only are going to make uh, other people feel more the way that he's shooting for, but also maybe makes things a little more efficient uh, for him on his side of things. What about
absolutely.
on this when it comes to growth? What are some of the things you see that really slow down people's growth?
Again, I think lack of clarity is the biggest factor. Sometimes I'm working with companies that are growing exponentially externally, meaning their customer base is, they can't keep up with it. So they're having to do massive hiring to keep up with delivery, what have you. But I also work with companies who are growing internally in preparation for that external growth. And in both cases, having the clarity and consistency is the key to that growth being as painless as possible. It's never going to be completely pain free. But again, when everyone is on the same page, when we can build a process of, um, let's say, customer acquisition, and we can briefly describe everything that happens from the first time that customer is exposed to our company until they sign their first deal, whatever that is. And everyone involved in that process, whether it is marketing, um, pre-sales, meaning someone who would do like quoting or anything like that, the actual salespeople, when they all have exposure to that core process, and then we can also create documentation around how their specific functions impact the whole process, you can imagine the clarity that that provides and how much more, I don't know if responsible is the right word or respectful is the right word, but um, I'm going to go with respectful. How much more respect each individual contributor has for everyone else who's part of the process, simply because they now understand having clarity in that overview. Again, we don't get into the nitty gritty in those cores of steps 1 through 5 on completing a form, let's say, because marketing doesn't need to know how sales completes that form. So we document that a little bit differently, but just being able to illustrate how things work is amazing. And it's always surprising to the leadership teams that I work with that they'll have someone who's been in a role 3 or 4 years who, until they see that, has never considered some of those other things. Or maybe they're doing their own pieces that we're doing detailed instruction on. They have been doing for 3 or 4 years those tasks in a different order, which is slowing them down. So there are a lot of just things that seem so minute that come out of documenting that surprise people.
Are there any metrics that you recommend people track just as kind of like tripwires to be able to be like, oh, look, we must lack clarity in some area because we're seeing X or Y?
There aren't necessarily metrics from a numbers standpoint, but if you are consistently getting a complaint from a customer, let's say, that's similar, that is 9 times out of 10 a system problem. You know, there's a glitch somewhere between, maybe it's between your marketing and your delivery, maybe it's between sales and delivery, whatever the case may be. But or you're seeing consistent questions from your employees. I talked to a woman, it's been a little while now, she became a client, but in our first meeting, she told me, Brandee, I feel like Google. I am Google for this company. Anything and everything I am asked. And that was stressful for her, but I'm not sure that she realized that's also stressful for the employees to feel like they can't make a decision without going to the owner. They can't, move from point A to point B. That slows down so many things, but it also um, eliminates just the passion that they have for their work because they don't feel like it really depends on them. They feel almost like a robot that she's programming with every answer to every question. So, does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, what about on the structure side? Zeroing in there into kind of the structure of the overall company, who's making decisions and that kind of thing. What are some of the things that can be done to fix some of, like, let's say you've got somebody who feels like they're kind of like the bottleneck, like this person you talked about, where for some reason everything is coming through them. What is the simplest change, if there is maybe one thing, maybe it's more involved than that, to move from one leader having to be kind of pulled into all these different directions?
Right. I think the core of that really is documenting. I think as you're building a company, whether you are doing that as solo as one person, or maybe, you've got 4 partners, but as you're building, everything is being built off of your knowledge and passion. So you are elbows deep in everything that's happening. But there certainly comes a point when, for the company to really be able to scale, you have to remove yourself to the point that you're not elbows deep in anything, but you have your fingertips on it all. And that is what documentation allows you to do, to make sure that everyone has access to the same information in the same way. I work with a lot of companies who um, train hands on. And for a lot of them, that's absolutely necessary based on what they do. But at the end of the day, there's a lot that slips through the cracks in those situations because even the best human trainer is still human. So if I'm the trainer and I show up for work today and I had a knockdown, drag out argument with my teenager in the carpool line, that's going to affect the way you're trained. I'm really sorry, but that's just how it works. And eventually, maybe things will come together, but that affects your first day, your second day, your third day, from an onboarding standpoint and from a training and execution standpoint. So when we can, again, document the process, and then as the trainer, I'm reviewing that with you. First of all, it forces me to stick to the actual script because I know that you have it. And second of all, it gives you that point of reference to always go back to, which again leads to that flow of information empowering each team member.
So foundationally, it sounds like the number one thing, just to kind of like get to the basics, is you need to have documentation. You need to basically memorialize everything to where it's not just out there in the ether.
Right.
And then the next step, well, I guess the next step would be training the people you have on that if you already have them. But let's say you don't, it would be onboarding. And now you have to get to the point where other people are now able to understand these things when they come in and they're new. Is there anything that you see people do that you feel like is not helpful when it comes to onboarding? Is there anything that you ever see people doing? You're like, that's a waste of time. Stop doing that. Do this instead.
I think overwhelming new hires is the biggest thing that I see. Sometimes less is more. And I think onboarding is somewhere where that applies. Let them master something before you throw something else at them. And just, some of the basics, like don't tell someone to do something that you would never do yourself. Maybe that's not part of your role now, but you have to convey that you understand how that works and that you would be willing to do it and able to do it if it came down to it. I don't know if I like that. You might want to edit that
well, well, is there a way? Is there a way to understand when they are ready to be like at the end of the day? I think everybody's kind of, you hire new employees, you're excited about them, but most people probably have, at least in the beginning, a little bit of you're wondering, are they really ready? Kind of like,
yeah.
your child going out into the world. Are they
Yeah.
ready? Is there anything you you can look for to get the sense that, like, okay, it's time? Or
Yeah.
is it a situation where you just have to let them fly and see what happens?
I think that really depends on the role, and what they're doing. In a lot of things, you can observe what they're doing and know they've got it or they don't. But when we do documenting, there are systems that I use to build training that we can embed testing in, even. In some companies that I work with, you know, on the overview processes that I was talking about, the core process where everybody's just kind of getting exposure, maybe a passing score on those tests is 80% because we just want them to have the general idea of how to get from point A to point B to point C. But then the specific role content, a passing score may be 100% because it's really important that you get this right. The stakes are high. Um, so that is a way as well.
And is training included in that I mean, obviously there's going to be some training, but I mean, when you're talking about that as far as auditing processes and things like that, is there how important is ongoing training, and where does that come into play for companies who are really wanting to make sure their processes are locked up tight?
Yeah, I think ongoing training is really important, and that is part of the culture, right? The idea is to build documentation so that you have a single source of truth in the company for who we are and how what we do and how we do it, right? So when you're first introducing that, involving each individual contributor in the build process is how you can speed up and strengthen adoption of that playbook, so to speak. Then it's a matter of adopting that and running your business with that as your single source of truth. If you're Google for your company and this has been built, then when someone's knocking on your door frantically with a question, as much as you want to make it easy and respond, you need to take a deep breath and say, have you checked our playbook? You
Right.
know, it's redirecting the way people operate and where they go to consume information.
And is there a so for the kind of skills where you just very critical skills, are there any recommended ways to actually train those skills, like the ideal sort of way? You mentioned that different people learn different ways. Maybe it's a matter of teaching everything in a number of ways.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. I think it's giving them options for how to consume the information. Again, whether that's reading, whether that is testing, whether that's watching videos, whether that is, pairing them up with a mentor, and then finding the balance in that based on what you do and who your people are, really. Um, I've worked with several services companies, excuse me, where obviously the techs in the field consume information and learn differently, want to learn differently than the administrative teams in the offices. So as we're building, we have to take that into account, of course.
All right, last question. When it
Sure.
for and you've touched on this a little bit, but for standard operating procedures,
Hmm.
and what are the best ways, the best things that people can do to make sure that those are all in one place, that they're easily found, that you have a spot where you can say, okay, I'm not going to answer that. You need to go here.
Yeah. There are actually a couple of different platforms that I work with, and I can help people make that right decision for their company for that. That way it's online, accessible 24/7 to everyone. I think the days of having your SOPs as printed PDFs in a binder on a shelf have passed because
Oh,
if you did
thankfully.
that 5 years ago, that binder's probably still on the shelf.
Right.
Um,
And people
so
who don't work in the office don't even have access to the shelf.
exactly, exactly. So it is an undertaking, but the payoff is, I think, at least 10x what people expect it to be. Most of the time, people bring someone like me in because there's a single process in their company that they know isn't working. But what they don't take into account is how changing that process and changing the way people access information changes the way that they feel about their work, which obviously changes the way they perform, changes how long they stay, impacts the culture, all the good things.
Now you have an audit that people can go through for their processes. Can you talk to us about that and tell people where they can get it?
Absolutely. I offer a self-guided process audit at no cost. It can be requested through my website, which is brandeejustus.com, brandeejustus.com. And that just offers a series of questions designed to examine, again, how information is flowing for the company. It looks at onboarding, training, policies, and procedures, as well as general company information, just to give leaders an idea of where the bottlenecks might be. So that is a great starting point. If you feel like something's off, or if you know you're preparing for growth and you're holding your breath, you're a little skittish because you don't know that you can work any more hours in a week or that you can provide any more guidance, then the audit is a great place to start and just kind of to evaluate what the plan should look like.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Brandee. I hope you'll come back.
Thank you. It was great, Roy. I appreciate it.